I stared at my phone screen, my hands trembling so violently that I almost dropped it. The text message from my father glowed in the darkness of my apartment. "I'm done with you. Don't contact me again unless you apologise to your brother and transfer another $50,000 for his business. Talk to my lawyer." $50,000, just like that, as if I were an ATM machine, not his daughter. But it was the video that shattered me completely. My aunt, the only person in that house who ever showed me kindness, had secretly sent it to me just minutes after that text. The footage was from the security camera in my father's living room. There they were, Richard, Linda and Kyle, glasses of expensive scotch in their hands, laughing like they had just pulled off the heist of the century. "That idiot paid again," my father's voice boomed through the speakers, his face red with alcohol and amusement. "I already withdrew all the money from her savings account to buy Kyle that Mercedes. Does she think she's my real daughter? She's just a financial tool, that's all she's ever been." Kyle, my half-brother, raised his glass with a smirk. "Just wait until she finishes paying off this house. Then we'll kick her to the curb." Linda, my stepmother, cackled in agreement. I should have cried. I should have screamed. Instead, I felt something cold and sharp crystallise in my chest. I walked to the mantel and picked up the family photo from Kyle's birthday dinner just hours ago. We all looked so perfect in that frame. I hurled it against the wall, watching it explode into 1,000 pieces, just like every illusion I had ever held about family. I texted back one word, "okay." But before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you how I dismantled their entire world piece by piece, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever felt used, dismissed, or treated like you were less than you are, hit that like button. Subscribe to hear how this story ends, because trust me, they never saw what was coming. And drop a comment telling me if you've ever had to cut toxic people out of your life. Now let me take you back to where this all began. It started on a freezing February evening in Manhattan, 3 months before that text message destroyed whatever remained of my naive hope. I was rushing from my office in Midtown, my heels clicking against the icy pavement as I tried to make it to Cipriani on time. It was Kyle's birthday, and even though I had worked a brutal 12-hour day, managing portfolios for high-net-worth clients, I couldn't be late. Being late meant disappointing Richard, and disappointing Richard meant enduring his silent treatment for weeks, or worse, his public humiliation. I had bought Kyle a Mont Blanc pen set, something tasteful and expensive enough to avoid Linda's passive-aggressive comments about how I never appreciated what they did for me. What had they done for me? I couldn't remember anymore. The memories of my childhood had become a blur of being told I should be grateful that I was lucky Richard had kept me after my mother died when I was 8. My mother. I barely remembered her face anymore, just flashes of warmth and the smell of lavender. Richard remarried Linda within a year, and suddenly I had a stepmother who looked at me like I was a stain on her designer furniture, and a half-brother who learned early that tormenting me came with no consequences. When I walked into Cipriani that night, I saw them immediately. Richard sat at the head of the table in his tailored suit, looking every bit the successful businessman he pretended to be. Linda was dripping in jewellery, her face frozen in that perpetual look of disdain she reserved especially for me. Kyle lounged in his chair, scrolling through his phone, with the entitled air of someone who had never worked a real day in his life. "You're late," Richard said coldly before I even sat down. "We've been waiting for 45 minutes. "I'm sorry, Dad. There was a client emergency and I couldn't leave until it was resolved." I slipped into my seat, setting Kyle's gift on the table. "Happy birthday, Kyle." He didn't even look up from his phone. "Thanks, I guess," Linda sniffed. "You look like you slept in those clothes, Sarah. Couldn't you have at least tried to look presentable for your brother's special day?" I was wearing a blouse and slacks from Banana Republic, the same outfit I wore to manage millions of dollars in assets every day. But nothing I wore was ever good enough for Linda, unless it came from the same boutiques she frequented, paid for with money I had given them. Dinner was excruciating. I smiled and nodded as Kyle bragged about his latest failed business venture, some cryptocurrency scheme that had already burned through $30,000 of what I assumed was my money. Richard talked endlessly about his golf game, dropping names of people at the country club where I paid his membership fees. Linda complained about the service, the food, the temperature anything to fill the air with her dissatisfaction. When the bill came, I watched Richard casually hand over his credit card. I knew what was coming. I had seen this performance before. The waiter returned moments later, leaning down to whisper discreetly that the card had been declined. But Richard was never discreet about these things. His face turned purple with rage. "What do you mean it's declined? There's plenty of money in that account." He turned to me, his voice rising so that nearby tables started to stare. "Sarah, this is your fault. You didn't transfer this month's allowance yet." I felt heat creep up my neck. "Dad, I transferred $5,000 last week just like always." "Well, it's not enough, is it?" He threw the card down on the table. "You make all this money working in finance and you can't even make sure your father has access to funds. Do you know how humiliating this is?" Kyle joined in with a cruel laugh. "Come on, Dad, she's basically a walking ATM anyway. Let her pay. It's the least she can do since she couldn't even bother to show up on time looking decent." The words hit me like a slap, but I swallowed my hurt and reached for my purse. I pulled out my credit card, the one I had been saving for emergencies, and handed it to the waiter. $5,000 for a dinner, where I was treated like hired help. The waiter took it with an apologetic look that made my humiliation complete. "About time," Linda muttered, not even bothering to thank me. I rode home alone in an Uber that night while they took the car service I had also paid for. I sat in my small one-bedroom apartment in Queens, not the spacious place in Manhattan I could have afforded if I wasn't supporting an entire household of leeches, and I told myself the same lie I had been telling myself for years. They're family. Family sticks together. Things will get better. Then came that night, 3 months later, when the text message and video shattered every delusion I had left. After I replied with that single word, "okay," I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and I started digging. You see, what Richard and Linda and Kyle never understood was that I wasn't just some paper pusher in finance. I was a senior portfolio manager, specializing in forensic accounting. I knew how to follow money trails. I knew how to spot fraud. And I had access to tools and databases that would make a detective jealous. What I found in those early morning hours made me physically sick. Richard hadn't just been taking my monthly transfers. He had been forging my signature on loan documents. There were 3 separate personal loans totaling over $200,000, all in my name, all taken out over the past 5 years. He had used my social security number, my employment information, my credit score. He had been committing identity theft against his own daughter. But it got worse. I found tax documents showing that Richard had been claiming me as a dependent for years while simultaneously reporting my financial transfers to him as gifts to avoid taxation. He had opened credit cards in my name and maxed them out. My credit score, which I had spent years building to a perfect 820, had been demolished without my knowledge. I pulled up the deed to the house in Connecticut, the house where Richard and Linda lived in luxury. The house I thought Richard owned free and clear. It was mortgaged to the hilt, and the mortgage payments I discovered came directly from an account that drew from my checking account every month through an automatic transfer I had never authorized. By sunrise, I had compiled a folder of evidence that would make any prosecutor salivate. But I wasn't going to prosecutors yet. First, I had to cut off their lifeline. I started making calls as soon as the banks opened. My first call was to American Express, reporting all supplementary cards on my account as stolen. Linda's platinum card that she used for her spa days and shopping sprees cancelled. Kyle's card that funded his gambling addiction and bottle service at clubs gone. I could almost hear the satisfying click as those credit lines died. Next, I called my bank's fraud department. I told them I had discovered unauthorized withdrawals from my accounts and suspected my identity had been compromised. Within an hour, all accounts that Richard had access to were frozen pending investigation. That included the joint account he had convinced me to open for emergencies, which I now realized he had been draining systematically for years. Then I got creative. I called the utility companies for the Connecticut house. As the person whose name was on all the accounts, because of course I was paying for everything, I had them disconnect the electricity, water and gas effective immediately. I cancelled the internet service. I called the country club where Richard spent his afternoons pretending to be a titan of industry and cancelled his membership citing non-payment. Each phone call felt like removing a leech from my skin. With every account I closed, every service I terminated, I felt lighter, freer. The next morning I went to work as usual. I didn't call in sick. I didn't hide. I walked into my office on the 47th floor of a building that overlooked Central Park. And I met with my lawyer, James Morrison, an old friend from business school, who had made a name for himself in litigation. "Sarah, this is massive identity theft," James said, his eyes widening as he reviewed the documents I had compiled. "We're talking federal crimes here. Bank fraud, tax evasion, wire fraud. Your father could be looking at serious prison time." "Good," I said, and I meant it. James drew up a restraining order immediately. He also prepared a cease and desist letter and contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I provided them with everything, every forged signature, every fraudulent loan application, every piece of evidence I had gathered. That afternoon, Linda's world started crumbling. She was at her usual day spa in Greenwich, halfway through a hot stone massage that cost $300 when her credit card was declined. According to my aunt, who heard it from the spa owner, Linda had screamed at the staff, insisting there must be a mistake, that she was a valued customer. When they ran the card 3 times, and it declined each time they asked her to leave, Linda had to call a friend to come pay her bill, and the humiliation of it for a woman who prided herself on her social standing was apparently spectacular. Kyle's reckoning came even faster. He had been at an underground poker game in Brooklyn, the kind where you needed cash or a guaranteed credit line to play. He had been losing badly, and when he tried to withdraw money to cover his debts, every single transaction was declined. The men running that game weren't the patient type. According to the police report I saw later, they had Kyle cornered in an alley when patrol cars happened by. Kyle, in his panic, tried to drop my name, saying his sister would wire the money. But when they called the number, I had already blocked it. Richard got the worst wake-up call of all. He received a formal notice from his bank that his accounts were under federal investigation for suspicious activity and possible fraud. All his accounts frozen. Every credit card cancelled. The mortgage payment on the Connecticut house bounced, triggering a default notice. His cell phone service was cut off because of course I'd been paying that bill too. I expected them to slink away in shame. I should have known better. 2 days later I was in a meeting with a client when my assistant knocked on the conference room door, her face pale. "Sarah, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but security called. There are 2 men in the lobby causing a scene and demanding to see you." I excused myself and walked to the elevator bank. Through the glass walls that overlooked the lobby 47 floors below, I couldn't see the commotion, but I could imagine it. I took a deep breath, smoothed my skirt, and rode the elevator down with James, who I had called the moment I got the news. The lobby of our building was all marble and glass, designed to impress wealthy clients. It was not designed for the circus that Richard and Kyle had brought with them. Kyle was screaming at the security guards, his face red and twisted with rage. Richard stood beside him, playing the wounded father to a small crowd of onlookers that had gathered. "My daughter works here," Richard was saying loudly, his voice echoing off the marble. "She's stolen everything from me, cleaned out my accounts. I'm an old man, and my own child is trying to destroy me. Where is the justice in this world?" I stepped out of the elevator with James at my side, my heels clicking across the floor with deliberate calm. The sound made Kyle spin around. When he saw me, his expression morphed from rage to something uglier. "There she is," he shouted, pointing at me like I was a criminal. "You think you can just cut us off after everything we've done for you?" The lobby had gone completely silent. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, including those of colleagues and clients. This was exactly what Richard wanted, a public spectacle designed to humiliate me into submission. But I had learned something in my years in finance. The person who stays calm holds all the power. "Mr. Morrison is my attorney," I said clearly, my voice steady. "If you have any legal concerns, you're welcome to speak with him. However, you are both currently trespassing on private property." Richard's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the ugly truth underneath. "Don't you dare talk to me about trespassing, you ungrateful little bitch. I raised you, I fed you, I put a roof over your head. Everything you have is because of me." James stepped forward, pulling out a document from his briefcase. "Mr. Crawford, my name is James Morrison, and I'm representing Sarah Crawford in legal proceedings against you. This is a restraining order, effective immediately. You are prohibited from contacting my client coming within 500 feet of her residence or workplace and making any further attempts to access her financial accounts. He handed the papers to a stunned Richard, then turned to Kyle. Mr. Kyle Crawford, you are also named in this order. Additionally, I've been authorized to inform you that evidence of identity theft, bank fraud, and tax evasion has been submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You should expect to hear from them shortly. He lunged at me, and for a moment I thought he might actually hit me. But James was faster stepping between us, while simultaneously signalling to security. I would strongly advise against any physical contact, Mr. Crawford. There are approximately 30 witnesses here, not to mention security cameras. That's when Richard made his fatal mistake. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to bruise. You think you're so smart, don't you? You're nothing without me. Nothing. I made you and I can destroy you. The security guards pulled him off me while I stood perfectly still, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. You made me, I said softly, so only he could hear. You spent 20 years using me as your personal piggy bank. You forged my signature on loan documents. You destroyed my credit. You used my identity to commit fraud. You didn't make me Dad. You tried to break me, but I'm done being your victim. The NYPD arrived within minutes. I had already called them before coming down to the lobby, knowing exactly how this would play out. They arrested Kyle first for disorderly conduct and assault on the security guard he had pushed. Then they escorted Richard out in handcuffs, while he shouted about his rights and his ungrateful daughter. I watched them go and I felt absolutely nothing. No sadness, no guilt, no second thoughts. Just a strange, peaceful emptiness, where their voices used to echo in my head, telling me I was never enough. Over the next few weeks I worked with James and a team of forensic accountants to build an ironclad case. What we discovered was even worse than I had imagined. Richard hadn't just stolen from me, he had been running a long con on multiple people using his connections at the country club to bilk other families out of money with fake investment schemes. I was just his most reliable source of funds because I was too broken and desperate for his approval to say no. We also found something that changed everything I thought I knew about my mother's death. In a box of old financial records from my mother's estate, I found letters from her to a lawyer. She had been planning to divorce Richard, citing emotional abuse and financial control. She had documented his attempts to isolate her from her family, his rage when she questioned his spending, his systematic destruction of her self-esteem. My mother hadn't died from a sudden illness like Richard always told me. She had died from suicide overdosing on sleeping pills in a hotel room where she had gone to escape him. Richard had hidden the truth, paid off the right people, and spun a story about a tragic heart condition. He had let me grow up thinking my mother abandoned me, when the truth was he had driven her to such despair that death seemed like her only escape. I cried for 3 days when I learnt the truth. Not pretty tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of grief I didn't know existed. James sat with me, and my aunt came to stay, and together they held me while I mourned not just my mother, but the childhood I never got to have, and the family that was always a lie. But grief turned to determination. I wasn't just going to reclaim my money. I was going to make sure Richard faced justice for what he did to my mother and to me. The trap I set was almost too easy. I had James reach out to Richard's lawyer with a settlement offer. I claimed I had overreacted and wanted to reconcile. All Richard had to do was come to a meeting at the Connecticut house to sign some paperwork transferring certain assets, and I would drop all charges and restore his accounts. Richard, Linda and Kyle arrived at the house looking smug and victorious. They thought I had broken, that I had come crawling back with my checkbook open. They had no idea that I had purchased the house's defaulted mortgage from the bank for pennies on the dollar. Legally, I owned the property they were living in. They walked into the living room where I was waiting with James and a notary public. The papers were laid out on the coffee table looking official and intimidating, with their legal jargon and red tabs marking signature lines. "I'm glad you came to your senses," Richard said, settling into his favourite armchair like he owned the place. Which, ironically, he didn't anymore. "Family is family, Sarah. We may have had our disagreements, but blood is thicker than water." I smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Before we begin, I want to make sure we're all clear about what you're signing. James, can you explain? James pulled out 3 identical folders. These documents acknowledge personal liability for all fraudulent loans taken out in Sarah's name. By signing, you are assuming full financial and legal responsibility for repaying those debts, which currently total $273,000, including interest and penalties. Richard's face went slack. That's not what we discussed. Actually, I said, standing up and walking to the window, we never discussed anything. You received an offer to meet. You assumed the rest. But here's the thing, Dad. Or should I call you Richard? I don't think you've earned the title of father. Kyle jumped up. This is bullshit. You can't do this. Actually, I can, I replied calmly. You see, while you 3 were living in this house rent-free, the mortgage went into default. I bought the debt from the bank. This house is mine now. Those signatures you were about to give would have been your acknowledgement of the fraud you committed. But honestly, I don't need them. That's when I walked to the TV and turned it on. The screen filled with footage from the security camera, the same video my aunt had sent me. The 3 of them watched themselves laugh about using me, calling me an ATM, planning to discard me once they had drained me dry. Linda's face went white. Where did you get that? It doesn't matter where I got it, I said. What matters is that I've compiled this footage along with all the financial records showing your fraud, and I've been streaming this entire meeting live to a very interested audience. I gestured to the laptop on the side table, which showed a live feed with over 3,000 viewers, including several of Richard's business associates and country club friends. The comments were rolling in, expressing shock and disgust. Richard stood up, his face purple with rage. You little cunt! After everything I've done for you! He came at me with his hand raised, and I didn't move. I didn't flinch. Because I knew what he didn't. Standing in the shadows of the hallway were 2 bodyguards I had hired specifically for this moment. They stepped forward as Richard's hand came down, catching his wrist mid-swing. Kyle, seeing his father restrained, pulled a small paring knife from the fruit bowl on the table. It was almost funny the way he held it, like he was some kind of action hero. He didn't get 2 steps toward me before the second bodyguard had him on the floor, the knife clattering away harmlessly. The front door burst open and NYPD officers flooded in. I had tipped them off about the meeting and suggested they might want to be nearby. They arrested Richard for attempted assault. Kyle was charged with assault with a weapon. Linda, who had just sat there in shock, was later charged as an accessory to fraud. As they were being led out in handcuffs, Richard looked at me with pure hatred. You're dead to me. You hear me? Dead. I met his eyes without fear. Good. Because you've been dead to me since the moment I saw who you really are. The trial was all over the news. Richard's fake business persona was exposed. His country club friends abandoned him. The evidence was overwhelming, thousands of pages of financial documents, video evidence testimony from bank officials and forensic accountants. Richard was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion. Kyle got a suspended sentence and mandatory rehab for his gambling addiction, plus probation that would follow him for years. Linda avoided jail time, but lost everything in the asset seizure that accompanied Richard's conviction. My aunt kept me updated, though I never asked. Linda had taken a job as a cashier at a ShopRite in Newark, one of those massive grocery stores, where she used to send her housekeeper to shop because she considered it beneath her. Now she stood behind Register 7 for 8 hours a day, scanning items and bagging groceries while wearing a polyester vest with a name tag. The woman who once wore nothing but designer labels now had to ask permission for bathroom breaks. She lived in a studio apartment above a laundromat in a neighbourhood she would have crossed the street to avoid in her former life. The place was 400 square feet, my aunt told me, with a kitchen so small you could touch both walls at once. Linda took the 107 bus to work every morning at 5:30, the same bus route she used to see from her Mercedes, and comment on how sad it was that people had to live like that. The irony was so perfect it almost seemed scripted. My aunt said she ran into Linda at a discount store once, watching her frantically compare prices on generic brands of cereal, something Linda used to mock other shoppers for doing. When Linda saw my aunt, she had turned away quickly, but not before my aunt caught the shame in her eyes. The woman who had spent 20 years looking down her nose at everyone now couldn't meet anyone's gaze. Kyle's fall was even more complete. With a criminal record for assault with a weapon and a documented gambling addiction, no legitimate company would touch him. He had applied to hundreds of jobs, everything from warehouse work to delivery driver positions, but the background checks always came back to haunt him. The probation officer's report that my lawyer shared with me noted that Kyle had been rejected from even fast food chains. He ended up moving in with Linda, sharing that tiny studio apartment where they slept on a pull-out couch that never quite folded back right. My aunt mentioned hearing them argue through the thin walls when she visited once. Kyle blamed Linda for not stopping Richard. Linda blamed Kyle for pulling that knife and making everything worse. They were two drowning people trying to push each other under, trapped together in the poverty they had spent their entire lives mocking and avoiding. Kyle did odd jobs for cash when he could find them painting fences or moving furniture. The kind of manual labour he used to laugh at other people for doing. His hands, which had never held anything heavier than an Xbox controller or a martini glass, were now calloused and rough. The country club boy was gone, replaced by someone who counted quarters for the laundromat. I didn't take pleasure in any of this. That's what surprised me most. I thought I would feel vindicated, triumphant, satisfied. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. It was like hearing about the weather in a city I'd never visit, or reading about strangers in a news article. Their suffering didn't move me, because they had stopped being real people to me the moment I saw that video. They were strangers, now faces I vaguely recognized from another lifetime. I had no connection to their pain because they had severed any real bond between us long before I cut the financial ties. They had shown me exactly who they were, people who saw me as a resource to exploit rather than a person to love, and I had finally believed them. 6 months after the trial ended, I was standing on the balcony of my new penthouse apartment in Manhattan. I had finally bought the place I deserved, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The fall air was crisp, and the city lights sparkled like stars brought down to earth. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I knew before I opened it that it would be Linda. She had tried reaching out a few times through various numbers, and each time I had blocked her. "Sarah, please, I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need help. I can't afford my medications and the rent is due. Please, I'm begging you, I'm sorry for everything." I looked at the message for a long moment. I thought about the years of put-downs, the casual cruelty, the way she had stood by and watched Richard destroy me piece by piece. I thought about my mother alone in that hotel room with no one to save her. I typed back slowly, "I don't know you, please direct all communication through my attorney." Then I blocked the number and set my phone down on the outdoor table where James was waiting with 2 glasses of wine. He had become more than my lawyer over these months. He was my friend, maybe more than that, and definitely someone who saw me for who I actually was. "Everything okay?" he asked. I smiled a real smile, the kind I hadn't been capable of a year ago. "Everything's perfect." We raised our glasses as the sun set over the city that had witnessed my destruction and my rebirth. I had lost a family I never really had, but I had gained something infinitely more valuable myself. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you are the ones who hurt you most. Sometimes family is a lie we tell ourselves to justify staying in situations that destroy us. But here's what I learned. You don't owe anyone your suffering. You don't owe anyone your silence. And you definitely don't owe anyone access to your life if all they do is take and take and take until there's nothing left. I had been their victim, their ATM, their scapegoat. But I chose to become something else. I became free. Now I want to know, have you ever had to walk away from people who were supposed to love you? Have you ever had that moment where you realised that protecting yourself meant letting go of people you thought you couldn't live without? Drop your story in the comments because I promise you, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button because next time I'll be sharing how I rebuilt my entire life from scratch and found my real family, the one I chose for myself. And smash that like button if you believe that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. Your story isn't over and neither is mine.